Hello and welcome to Dateline. I'm Martine Croxall. This week we discuss whether there are any signs of meaningful peace talks in the war in Ukraine. We look at the aftermath of the French presidential election and ask where Europe goes now. And we look ahead to the UK local elections and ask, could the outcome sink Boris Johnson? Joining us in discussion tonight, here in the studio at long last, the editor-in-chief of the Gulf-based daily The National, Mina Al-Arabi. I bet it feels good, Mina, doesn't it?
Does.
And you get your makeup done as well. The BBC's business editor Simon Jack, hot-footing in from whatever else he's been doing today. And Dateline's long-serving expert on all things French, Mark Roche, formerly London correspondent of Le Monde and now Le Point. Welcome to everybody. The United Nations boss has had talks this week with Presidents Putin and Zelensky. The US Secretary of State and the US Defence Secretary have been in Kiev. But what have these high-level diplomatic shuffles actually achieved? Mina, you watch all of this very closely for your readers and interpret it, contextualise it. What have you been telling them?
Well, the last few days, as you said, of diplomacy have been important to at least maintain the momentum of trying to get a solution. But we haven't seen anything tangible that brings this war to an end. Now, for our readers, there's the primary developments, which are the military developments on the ground. And of course, the Ukrainian people, what they're suffering, the fact that there was an attack on Kiev as the UN Secretary General was there, was again an indication of how serious this is, not only for the poor Ukrainian people who are suffering, but also wider ramifications. So there's that immediate element. Then there's the cost of oil going up, the fact that we worry about wheat imports in the Middle East, for example, in Egypt, 80% of wheat imports come from Ukraine and Russia. Likewise, for Lebanon, where it's at 90%. So, and world over, I mean, here in the UK, we're talking about cooking oil being a problem because so much of the world's cooking oil and wheat is impacted by that. And then there's the bigger picture, which is if we don't get peace in the next few weeks, what does this mean for the global order? And there's talk now that both President Zelensky and President Putin will be at the G20 summit in November. Hopefully the war hasn't dragged out that long, but all indications are is it could have dragged out that long. So could diplomacy then actually wield a result? And the fact that the G20 this year, the presidency is by Indonesia, that's trying to keep, I'd say, a somewhat neutral position to try to push both the Russians, but also the Americans, frankly, to try to find a solution.
Well, the Americans this week, Mark, President Biden's committed $33 billion for military, economic and humanitarian aid. But at the same time, lots of countries are still buying Russian oil and gas. How do leaders square that circle? Because it's sort of cancelling each other out, isn't it? The aid and then the fuel costs.
Well, I think first is that things are going badly for Putin because no, the West, the American, are giving masses of heavy armament and aid and economic aid. Also, the Europeans now are much more united because the blackmail on gas on Poland and Bulgaria misfired, and now the European Commission has decided to buy gas group to Qatar, to the USA, even to Israel. And thirdly, things are quite bad for Russia on the insurance market because the Russian crude can not get insurance from the Lloyd's of London. That's a decision that the British government might take. So all this is very negative, but at the same time, Russia has the upper hand because the Europeans are very divided between the hardline Eastern Europe and Northern Europe threatened by Russia, and the much more partisan of a soft approach like the German, and then the pro-Russian, which we forget, which is Greece, Malta and Cyprus. So that's an advantage for Putin. And then there's a big question about the effect of inflation and cost of living.
Exactly. That brings us very nicely on to what I was going to talk to you about, Simon, in terms of sanctions. How effective are they being? But down the track, there are ramifications not just for President Putin and his economy, but the rest of us.
True. I mean, one thing I think that Russia would consider a victory is that they have managed to split the European Union on their approach to how they're going to deal with this gas problem. Some people say they'll pay in rubles, some people say they won't. So they've actually managed to put a crack in that. The sanctions are, very damaging to the Russian economy. You could see output fall 15-20% there. But I don't think enough in the short term to deter Vladimir Putin in his endeavours. But I do think one of the other things, and you talked about inflation, I think that is the really big thing. So everyone in the West hopefully in 6 to 9 months, maybe a year, we'll get some resolution and everything will go back to normal. But I think the reality is that it will never again in our lifetime be considered to be acceptable strategically or politically to be that reliant on Russian fuel sources, and that means huge investment in renewables, finding other fuel sources. That means that these energy prices we see are not just a blip or a spike. This is a step change in the energy cost for Western economies, which will take years and will take huge amounts of money out of the economy. So I think the economic ramifications of this are pretty long term.
And I just want to pick up on that because part of the conversations that the world has been having about the energy transition and need to transition, there was a lot of pressure, particularly from the United States, to stop investing in hydrocarbon markets, to stop investing in oil development and so forth and exploration. And so you had everybody on the back foot, and then this crisis happened. So if anything, it proved that again, the American policy of almost saying we need to wipe our hands off this and we can just transition easily is not actually accurate. And so it's a very harsh lesson to learn because it will stay with us for years to come.
We'll see the oil and gas profits of some of the big ones next week. COP26 climate summit seems quite a long time ago right now.
Yeah, it does. Mark, we've heard though that whilst a lot of leaders around the world are keen to express their pro-Zelensky credentials, but we've also had President Putin saying, if anybody intervenes, you'll feel the force of our retaliation. So how far dare leaders go in their support of Ukraine without incurring the wrath of the Kremlin?
I think there's only one language Putin understands, it's strength. Because if you give away on anything to Putin, he will take advantage. So I think the West should resist like they do at the moment by giving money and giving armaments to Ukraine, and we shouldn't care about. The only thing that worries me is a certain Ukraine fatigue. Public opinion in the West, which has open arm welcome refugee, they start to be problem in Belgium, in France, with people finding the cost and the difficulties, and they could be there a fatigue on compassion, and that would be terrible.
Can I just pick up on that? Because up to now, they've repelled them from the West. Kyiv was seen as a victory. Everyone's really saying, plucky Ukrainians, let's give them some arms. What happens, talking to Jeremy Bowen, our foreign correspondent who's out there, saying, what happens if Russia starts winning in the East? Are you going to keep pushing arms military into that? That's a very different proposition, politically, domestically, to sell at home.
Yes, whether it's sort of a Western flank is a different prospect, isn't it? Because I suppose what this has done is brought NATO together in a way that Emmanuel Macron hadn't been as warmly disposed towards NATO until this crisis.
Well, absolutely. And in fact, during the campaign, he said against Marine Le Pen, who wanted to get out of the military command, he said we have to reinforce NATO, which for French people is quite surprising because Macron is a big defender of European defense. And so we can see in the coming time NATO killing in a way this idea of European defense.
And at the same time, it came just a few months after the Afghanistan withdrawal and no real stock taking of what happened in Afghanistan and the fact that NATO has swept that almost under the carpet and gone back and talked about Russia. But we'll see what happens with the NATO summit, where there was supposed to be this global view for NATO, and now they're back to the traditional role, let's say, of NATO.
And a final thought, if I may. You asked me where I'd been and I was rushing onto the set. I've been talking to Nikita Khrushchev's great-granddaughter, who just told me in an interview you can hear tomorrow morning on the Today programme, she thought that actually the world was closer to nuclear war now than they were in 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis, which gives me no pleasure to report that information, and she may be completely wrong, but there it is from Khrushchev's great-granddaughter.
What a name drop.
Sorry.
Anyway, we're glad you made it. Now, France has re-elected Emmanuel Macron as president, but not with a great amount of enthusiasm, it has to be said. His far-right opponent, Marine Le Pen, says that her vote share at 42% was unprecedented and still a victory for her party. So, Mark, France is clearly divided. What does Emmanuel Macron do about that?
I think France has never been so divided. It's generational, the young voting for Le Pen, the middle-aged and old voting for Macron. It's regional, north and east, where you have old industry and difficulties of reconversion voting for Le Pen, while the south and the west, where you have high-tech and services voting for Macron. It's social. You have the pro-LGBT and pro-Me Too and Black Lives Matter, the French version, voting for Macron, and the practitioner, Catholic traditionalist, voting for Le Pen. So it's divided on the whole line. More importantly, it's pushing Macron because of the first round, the left doing so well, the Corbynite left with Jean-Luc Mélenchon. It's pushing him to a terrain which is not favorable to him, which is the center-left. He's basically a right-wing politician who believes in deregulation, in increasing retirement, etc. And suddenly he's there. And that will mean that he will have to focus much more on internal affairs and on the question of immigration and all that than on his favorite patch, which is foreign affairs.
We've also got the legislative elections coming in France very soon, Mina. 577 members of the National Assembly to be voted for. If you don't hold the majority as the president, that makes things, whether you're the French president, the American president, lots of different leaders around the world find this, it's much harder to get your policies through.
And that's the big question that's waiting now. In a few weeks' time, will the French electorate go out and do what they usually do, which is support the party of the incumbent, or at least the political program of the incumbent president? Or do they actually, seeing the split that there is in the country and the abstention that we saw during the presidential elections, not deliver that for Macron, at which point he will be suffering throughout to try to implement any of his policies. And one of the issues is, and as an outsider and people looking towards France, is this idea that Marine Le Pen was able to get the percentage of votes above 40% was shocking. And so the question is, what is the long-term ramifications for France, but also the fact that the traditional parties, as we know them, have now gone. And so I think in countries like, for the example, in the UK, where it has to be the Conservatives or Labour predominantly, and we always thought you can't have new parties. Well, look at this. We have completely new parties shaping and dominating the political discourse in France.
Whether it's France or any other European economy at the moment, Simon, though, the problems are the same, aren't they? That a lot of leaders are grappling with those issues of the cost of living crisis, fuel security, which we've already touched on.
Yeah, it is a nightmare scenario for any finance minister. In France, for example, I get people asking me here in the UK, France capped its energy price rises at 4%. Why can't we do that here? I point out to them they have a state-controlled energy supplier called EDF, which took a massive hit. I think it was 8 billion at the time. That could be double that by now. And if you like, that is a national asset, that shareholding. So the public in some way have paid for that. I think it's very interesting, and we're talking about local elections, and we've got some coming up in the UK, which I think we may talk about. Any time where the electorate is getting poorer every day is a pretty toxic political situation to be in. The political mandate, the political offer you make to the citizens of any country is, stick with me, you'll be a bit better off by the time I'm finished than when we started. And it's very hard to see how any politician can deliver on that in the biggest squeeze we've seen. Yeah.
And by the way, Madame Le Pen did all her campaign not on the question of the veil for Muslim women, not on the question of her links with Russia and that sort of thing, only on the cost of living. And she got 42% on that. So it shows that it's the foremost now issue, and Macron will have to take care of that, despite the fact that, as you said, the energy prices are cut, inflation is much lower than here, there's more protection for workers. All this now, he can't touch that, because during the campaign he said, we'll have retirement above 65 instead of 60. No, he can forget that.
The problem as well is you mentioned that we stopped thinking about Afghanistan because everybody threw themselves into Ukraine, and that's exactly what Emmanuel Macron did. I mean, he didn't, certainly for the first round of the presidential election, he was barely visible, was he?
Yeah. And he, again, his turf where he's comfortable is foreign policy, that great statesman role, but he won't be able to get away from the problems that are, again, facing every world leader at the moment. But also, I think that for him, going forward, he's pledged to try to bring the country together, as many politicians do when they win elections. But there's no clear path of how he will be able to bring the country together.
What role might there be for Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who came third in the presidential election? The role of the Prime Minister with that big climate change remit? How tempted would Macron be to put him in that post?
Well, he can't put him in that post. It's the French electorate that has to decide. And Jean-Luc Mélenchon almost beat Marine Le Pen to be against. It would have been, I think, a much more interesting election. I think one of the scenarios possible but not probable is that Jean-Luc Mélenchon has the majority, or that Macron and then becomes prime minister, and then you have a complete dysfunctional government, president doing foreign affairs and defense, and a prime minister doing the economy, one on the right and the other on the left. So it would be for France a very bad time. But the polls show at the moment that Macron will have the majority, because generally people vote the same way for the presidency as the presidency in the parliamentary election. But surprise can happen.
Indeed, it certainly can. Well, let's carry on talking about different elections then, because as Simon said, next week there are local elections here in the UK, and the government under Boris Johnson is expected to lose a lot of support. But just how bad are those results likely to be? Could they be enough to trigger a vote of no confidence in the Prime Minister, which would have to come from a sufficient number of Conservative MPs, his own MPs? Simon, often in local elections, middle of a national government's term, the electorate are quite keen to give the incumbent government a bloody nose. To what extent is it that, or something greater this time?
Well, there were a couple of issues here. I mean, one thing is that you're right, that these are local elections. They are city councils, county councils, thousands of seats, what have you, where people will get to express democratically how they're feeling about life in general. And that can be seen as, and the particular importance of this one is that everyone is looking, including Boris Johnson's own MPs, they are still not sure whether the man who delivered a massive majority is still an electoral asset or has become, through various scandals, Partygate, etc., has become an electoral liability. Now, obviously, the papers, left and right, will give him a good kicking or what have you, but it hasn't really been tested yet about what is his electoral brand still worth. So people will be looking for that, and everyone will be, looking like hawks at it. However, many of these seats were won, for example, by Labour in times when Labour was doing very well. So the potential for a massive bloody nose in terms of huge numbers of county councils and city councils moving to Labour, many of them already are, is the thing we've got to remember. So to see, there won't be this kind of wave, but there will be little pockets in those red wall seats. These are seats that used to vote Labour year after year, generation after generation, which voted Conservative at that time. There will be little pockets there will people be looking at. Will it be a sea change? I'm not sure that it will deliver the definitive verdict on Boris Johnson's electoral brand as Prime Minister.
We have to remember, of course, in Northern Ireland, it's different again, isn't it? Because they're looking to actually get their devolved government at Stormont up and running and working again, because that's been rather dysfunctional for quite a long time. How is Boris Johnson regarded in the Gulf, Mina? Because he's made a big thing about, let's forget Partygate, we're getting on with the business, and He's had a lot of praise from Volodymyr Zelensky over the support that the UK has given to Ukraine.
He's quite popular in the Ukraine for sure. The way they look at him in the Gulf really is trying to understand if he will last as a politician. I mean, the UK's position as a country is still hugely important and influential in the Gulf. And so Boris Johnson really benefits from that rather than Boris Johnson himself delivering it. On the contrary, if you had, I believe, a stronger prime minister, the ties would actually be quite strong because of the absence of the US at the moment when it comes to the Gulf. So in some ways, he could do better. But given all his domestic woes, I think it's a wait-and-see situation. It was interesting to see when he went to India, he tried to stage all these moments, but it really didn't go very far. And again, the Indians are looking to the UK because of traditional ties with India rather than Boris Johnson himself really furthering much of these relationships. What's important, though, is, again, for the local elections, abroad, the way people see this is that, what does this mean for the government, but also how will the rise in cost of living, how will inflation actually impact this government and a strong economy like the UK's compared to other countries that are going to suffer actually much more from the rise of living costs around the world?
Because local politicians might have absolutely nothing to do with fixing these national problems, Mark, at all, but that's what people will choose to vote on next Thursday in some cases.
Well, local elections are, as Simon said, very often a protest vote on national issues. And I find Boris Johnson extremely vulnerable, not only because of Partygate, but for the first time you see possible successors showing up. The Defense Minister, Ben Wallace, did a very good thing with Ukraine, the Foreign Secretary, Liz Truss. Well, before these people were really not considered. No, they are really considered and taken very seriously. The problem is that he has to absolutely expect no gift from the Europeans, because Brexit is still, although in this country one doesn't speak a lot about it, in France it's still the issue that divides England, the UK from the European Union. And on all the thing on Brexit, he will be blocked by the European Union. So he can expect nothing on this side of the channel.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think we have seen, you talk about us not talking much about Brexit. I think people have been sort of cagey because they think that, that ship has sailed and maybe, but there's emerging evidence that, trade as a percentage of the UK's economy has fallen 2.5 times faster than any other G7 economy. You've had the UK here. They were supposed to have these border checks so they could check stuff coming in the same way their check going out. They've decided after many years and lots of millions of pounds of investment on these border posts, they say, actually, you know what, given what's going on in the world, we're not going to bother. So it's no surprise that if you look to Europe, the Conservative government is not going to find too many friends there. But again, the question will be, and you made that point, Martine, which is basically, do people blame their local councillor, who may be Conservative, for the fact that global oil and gas prices have hit historic levels and are doing so all around the globe? Or do they want their bins collected a bit more often? That will be some of those issues will be interesting.
And those councils that have got to provide those local services, like your bins being emptied, social services, education in some cases, they're struggling for money too, aren't they? Do they put up business rates and then drive for more businesses out of business, or do they reduce their aspirations when it comes to services because they've not got the money? Well,
we have in this country, as you do in Europe in many countries, there is an energy price cap for retail customers. That doesn't exist for government offices, for businesses, what have you. So if you are running social housing projects where you have to keep the heating on, you're running social care homes, the economics of that are disastrous at the moment. And I think that's where those are the kind of services where people feel that the energy crisis and what's going on actually hits their life. And whether they blame their local councillors, whether they blame Boris Johnson, or whether they blame Vladimir Putin for that, I think would be quite an interesting thing to see next week.
They've got quite a few people to choose from in the blame game.
Well, they do, but also I think that for those who feel strongly about Partygate and whether they can trust the conservatives or not. It really will come down to emotions and trust. This is a way to get that message across. So I think that in some cases, if people do blame the war in Ukraine or global developments, but they'll want to say, well, actually, but in the past year or two, we no longer trust the conservatives in the way that we did before. And that actually shows much more on local politics than on the national level. So it'll be interesting to see if people are...
Yeah, because I couldn't visit my mother in
Right,
a care home whilst you were blah, blah, blah. So
if
that's
there's
where the
a
local
way
and the
to get it
national-
out, that's... And the other question is, of course, where is Labour? I mean, if you had a really strong opposition party, I don't know how this government would have survived. And the Lib Dems, can they make a comeback? So I think those sorts of dynamics will be interesting.
It's not just even national, local, is it? It's even down to the personal in some cases at the moment. That's all we have time for this week. Thank you to our panellists, Mina, Mark and Simon. And thank you for watching. Do join us again next week. Same time, same place. Goodbye.